Go for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Barrie Friedland. I'm with Jacob Kravetz of Don't Shop on Tuesday, having another fascinating chat with a person doing important work at any time, but especially today. And we're talking to Gregg Wilhelm, who is Director of Creative Writing at George Mason University, who I can say in casual terms and in broad terms has dedicated his professional life to promoting reading and education and broadening our understanding in books and authors. Welcome, Gregg.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Jacob. It's a real pleasure to be here on Don't Shop on Tuesday. Look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I thought we'd start. Now, I've known you for a long time, and I first met you through Baltimore CityLit Festival that you've created that's still going strong. And you once said to me, and maybe I'm paraphrasing, that your mission is to elevate writing from just an assignment in high school to something so important and integral into our lives.
Yeah, and I'll put you a little bit on the spot, Barry. I think you were one of the very first. So I founded a nonprofit literary arts organization in Baltimore called CityLit Project back in 2004. And the origin of that organization is kind of interesting, but we do festivals and workshops and one-off events, and we have done outreach to kids and teenagers and high school youth in the past. But one of our very first things was a writing workshop that
First,
was led by Christine Stewart, who was an artist in residence at something called the Creative Alliance, which is an amazing organization also in Baltimore. And she was an artist in residence there, and she partnered with City Lit and presented these workshops. And you were part of that first cohort of writers in one of our very first early programs. So yeah, it's been over 20 years now.
years, and that helped me find my voice. I was always writing, and poor Jacob's ears are bleeding because too often say the best story wins.
One of her favorite lines, and for good reason.
And it's all about stories and how we all have stories and finding ways to get those stories out. We just talked before the filming started here about our the artwork that's in the background here and visual art. I'm a big fan of visual art. I'm a big fan of animation. I think I drew a lot of comics as a kid, Jacob, right? Sort of making my own
Mhm.
Batman stories and Spider-Man stories and drawing and writing comics. And if I, maybe if I'd stayed in that direction, I'd be working with the folks at Marvel or DC movies these days. But I'm very proud to have been able to carve out, a path that was, sort of unwalked and really wasn't a way or one path or like a program or a recipe or a trajectory that was available for me to follow. I just knew that I loved it. Like you said, Barry, I loved education. I loved literary art. I loved festivals. I loved doing the kinds of things that were important to me for people in the city that I love through the art form that means the most to me. So that was a lot of the early days of City Lit Project, which I'm proud to say continues on strongly since we transitioned leadership in 2016. And I took this job at George Mason, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, Northern Virginia, just outside of DC. And another wonderful writer and executive director, a nonprofit expert, Carlo Dupre, is now the executive director of City Lit, which still does amazing work across Baltimore and beyond.
And in a city filled with festivals, it is exciting to have one dedicated to writers and and books. I remember going and Jacobson, who wrote the biography of Steve Jobs.
Oh, uh, Joan Jacobson?
No, it was
No, the biography of Steve Jobs. Okay, that was at a festival.
yes, and his author, and he was telling his story about how difficult Steve Jobs was, and even though Steve Jobs had called him, and then it was I mean to be talking to this writer, I think it's William Jacobs. I should have checked that. but he wrote this big autobiography of, biography, I'm sorry, of Steve Jobs, and telling these horror stories. And someone in the room raised their hand and said, "Do you like him?" And the writer said, have you been listening to me? I mean, just meeting these writers, and the gentleman from Rwanda was
Oh,
also,
right, right.
so you got some really famous writers to come in and talk to us, and at the same time bring in new and young writers. It is just fantastic. Um, the City Lit, and survived COVID, survived everything.
Yeah, I'll briefly tell the story of the origin of CityLit because it is a pretty good story. The city of Baltimore had for a couple of years been hosting the Baltimore Book Festival, started in the mid 90s. And it was great. It was originally around the Washington Monument in the center of Baltimore's cultural district, lovely cobblestone streets. And it was, and we, I would, I've been in publishing since 1992. So I've always been publishing books and, having authors to present in one form or another. So I had a little bit of a presence at the Baltimore Book Festival. But in the fall of 2003, Hurricane Isabel came blowing through, and we have Hurricane Aaron off our shores as we speak today. Hurricane Isabel came blowing through Baltimore and canceled the annual Baltimore Book Festival. So a lot of us in the literary community got together to say, well, it would be a shame if a whole calendar year would go by if without a celebration of the literary arts in Baltimore. And so we decided to do a pared down version. Some of our headliners from September decided to come back from in December. And Dr. Carla Hayden, who at the time was the director of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, who has since gone on to a fantastic 14-year career as I believe it was 14 years, it could have been 14 years. Anyway, she was,
She's in 2016. She was appointed to Library of
yeah, thank
Congress.
you, Jacob. But a long and distinguished and important career as the Librarian of Congress, who was just a few months ago so unceremoniously dispatched by the Trump administration by a simple informal email. She said, have it here. She was open arms. I mean, she knew what kind of organizations we were. She was, at this amazing meeting place of Baltimoreans in the literary arts. So have it here at the Pratt Library. We decided to have it on December 7th, and the only snowstorm that we had that year happened on that day, December 6th. It was a Saturday, canceled the original City Lit Festival.
Oh
Strike
my
two.
goodness.
So we call all the headliners up again and say, look, this is so weird. Will you come back and give it a third try? And one of those headliners was a writer from DC by the name of Edward P. Jones. And he says, sure. Very shy, introverted man, great writer. We rescheduled the City Lit Festival, our third attempt to celebrate the literary arts in Baltimore in that calendar year, in April, again at the Pratt Library, the initial first City Lit Festival. I had just started this organization called City Lit, and we didn't know what to call this gathering. So I didn't even have the idea. My friend Kwame Alexander, who's gone on to fame and acclaim, he said, "Well, let's call it City Lit Festival." He was on the board of City Lit. Edward P. Jones comes back and highlights the event in April. 2 weeks before the event, he wins the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So we get a huge crowd.
Yeah.
The second April, we line up Steve Coll, Coll, who at the time was an editor at the Washington Post, and he had just published a nonfiction book on Bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And 2 weeks before the festival in April, Steve Coll wins the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. So literally, the buzz
So
in the book industry became, if you want to win the Pulitzer Prize, get yourself
you
booked.
got to get
In
invited.
the
The
festival.
headliner.
So we had a lot of really good luck. And then it became a really cool kind of complimentary event. The Baltimore Book Festival would happen in the fall, outdoors, had a lot of different aspects to it, food vendors, music, a lot of fun stuff. And then our indoor City Lit Festival happened in April, and that's been pretty much going on for the last 20 years.
You also found George Saunders before he blew up. You know,
Barely, barely. So because I had been in book publishing and because I had started CityLit, a lot of work, I had discovered that my own writing practice was starting to deteriorate and I wasn't writing myself. So I kind of, in my 40s, wanted to give myself a kick in the pants and enrolled, applied, got accepted to a low-res MFA in creative writing program at the University of Tampa. Very first cohort, a brand new program. Starting things, being entrepreneurial never scared me, so I wasn't worried that this was the first. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made for various reasons. But one of those reasons is it was the first director, Jeff Parker, was a graduate of Syracuse. He had connections to George Saunders. George Saunders came to the program in Florida. I met George Saunders, and I kid you not, I called him up the weekend before, no, yeah, it was the weekend in January after I'd met him to come and be part of City Lit that next April. On the same weekend that the New York Times wrote a review of his brand new book, The 10th of December, and it basically said if you read one book in 2005, what it was, no, it was 20, must have been 2013, 2012. If you read one book this year, read George Saunders' 10th of December. And he went through the roof. He came to the festival. The festival was packed. Um, well, he had a reputation. George Saunders was one of the few writers that would appear on David Letterman. He's got a great backstory, so that was great. And we just had a lot of luck um, because I collaborated and partnered with other book lovers, and we really curated really tight, important, good festivals.
can I just correct something that I said? It was Walter Isaacson who wrote.
Walter Isaacson, yes, right, right. Who's the CEO of the Aspen Institute, I do believe. Yeah, he had that book out on Jobs. And we've had all kinds of poets, fiction writers, short story writers, and creative nonfiction writers and journalists. And also, I remember we would do issue-oriented panels. We had like a panel on racism. We featured Jabari Asim, who had just come out with his book. He is a professor at Emerson in Boston. He had just come out with The N-Word, a book about the N-Word. So we talked about racism. We've had panels on topics like gun violence in Baltimore with journalists who have written books about the police department and whatnot. Of course, we've had things related to The Wire. So a lot of our stuff, in addition to celebrating the art of writing, is deliberately um, addresses pertinent issues important to things on the Black Butterfly of Baltimore, redlining, schools, things that are important topics to of the time for those citizens of Baltimore and the area.
Yeah. So, as someone who's been in both, writing, but also organizing and sort of promoting storytelling and story consumption to a certain extent. Um, how do you feel sort of in this moment? I'm
Mhm.
thinking a lot about how both of those activities, the arts in general are both under sort of, as I was mentioning before, under both political and technological sort of attack. And I was just looking up, and most recent stats say nearly a quarter of adults haven't read a book in the past year.
Yep.
The drop in people who are reading, period, seem, decade over decade seems, quite large. It's fallen like 12% in the last decade in terms of people who report reading at all. um and so, yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are around what is potentially lost, what the importance for human connection for us societally is in terms of consuming. You mentioned as well that you do like that you're a big advocate and passionate about other things like animation, so it's obviously doesn't in your mind have to be the written word that's communicating, but sort of how writing and storytelling, are existing in this moment, and what the opportunities there are, but also, sort of what the dangers are if we lose some, a lot of that as
That's
a
a
cultural practice.
That's a great topic and a great question, Jacob. And I have 15-year-old and 13-year-old case studies just upstairs that I can sort of observe when it comes to this evolving, technological lifestyle of ours. Thank goodness, knock on wood, they still enjoy reading. There was that Get Caught Reading campaign not too long ago, and I got caught both of my children reading this afternoon. But it's changing, and I see it. You mentioned fewer and fewer adults are reading books, and I just read an article not too long ago about how high schoolers are going through high school without having being assigned an entire novel to read and study. There are a lot of things going on with coming out of COVID, being alone, feeling loneliness, coping with loneliness, being okay in silence, long spans of attention on something that is printed on a page and non-reflective, as opposed to images on a device is shining blue light at you. All kinds of people much smarter than I am have done all kinds of neurological studies on the effects on not only devices and screens, but also conversely, sort of the lack of reading and how parts of our brain aren't firing the way they used to fire. And we are a storytelling species. I mean, that's been one of the things that has been the common thread throughout evolution is our desire to tell and share and pass down stories. So, I'm not a Luddite and I do like technology. Technology played a big, important role in my ability to sustain my publishing career at a time when technology was changing. Printing presses were, in big factories were becoming small digital printing things that could fit in the size of your basement. Um, it presented a different economic budget picture for me as a publisher, but it also allowed me to publish riskier things, fiction and poetry that I may not have touched as a more traditional publisher who would have to publish, manufacture 5,000 units of something to make the budget work. So I see a lot of that as being very much a pro and not a con. And I think storytelling is changing. Episodic television has taken over sort of where our reading capacity used to be. And there's some really fine and awesome episodic television writing going on, starting way back with The Wire, filmed and created in Baltimore back in the day. Um, so I try not to be angry at today's generations and how they're reading and being appreciative of the fact that they still like to engage stories, and it's different than the way I engage stories, and it'll probably be different than the way my kids engage stories. Um,
Do you
that
think that
said,
there is?
go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering in terms of that storytelling. Is there are there lessons to be learned as you look at, especially sort of in the newer in sort of the newer ways that stories are being consumed with sort of like the informational, maybe there's a loss of nuance and complexity, but sort of the informational density and how quickly stories are now being sort of told and communicated, in terms of how to distill an idea down or something, you know, down to be able to tell a complete story within like 30 seconds, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that within these sorts
I
of things.
worry that I worry that good stories that are important stories might come across as too ephemeral and not have the kind of traction that, say, a Rashomon did back in the day, or the
Mhm.
poetry of Basho, or things from around the world that are still referenced and revered today. Um, because it's a to don't shop on Tuesday. It's a throwaway society, isn't it? And to look at it from the publishing point of view, writers put a lot of time and effort, years into the manufacturing of their manuscript. Hopefully, they get an agent. Hopefully the agent sells that project. Hopefully it gets published well with a modicum of professional editing, design, and marketing acumen behind it. And not only, back when I was at the height of my publishing career and the big chain bookstores, Barnes and Noble, which is kind of making a comeback, Borders, which came and went and is no more. Um, it was all about real estate. And if that book that wasn't labored over by the artist, thought about, and money was spent by the publisher, it had like 6 weeks to live on the real estate of the bookshelf. There was plenty more product coming behind it for that bookseller to replace it on the bookshelf with something that might potentially sell.
Mm.
And that breaks my heart, to think about the time and care that I know I've put into my books, editorially, design wise, and marketing, to meet a marketplace that gives it such a short window of opportunity to succeed. I think some of that has changed with online, not necessarily online retail venues, but definitely online review platforms that give
Mm.
both new and older books second life. Last summer, I read a book called Stoner, and the name of the author has just leaped out of my mind. But I've read there's a bio about it. Um, the man, John Williams, Stoner and the Writing Life, and this is a bio about that book, the man who wrote the perfect novel,
Mm.
that won the National Book Award in 1971 with our John Barth, who was teaching at Hopkins at the time. John Barth's book. So there are places, what I'm trying to say, there are places that can rediscover things like Stoner that was written in the early 70s and give it new life. And I think that's really cool. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book when I read it last summer, and I'm halfway through this biography of the writer. Yeah, so I do worry about now we're getting into my classroom territory a little bit, and the kinds of because we at George Mason University, we have phenomenal teachers, highly acclaimed literary artists who are also dedicated teachers. We have a community of about 70 graduate students, which is large for an MFA program, and then another community of about 100 undergraduates, because we also have a BFA in creative writing program. Now, I routinely teach the capstone class in the BFA program. So that's seniors, 22-year-olds who are in the creative writing program. So I see a lot of the effects of COVID when they were high schoolers or middle schoolers. And then the other impacts of TikTok, BookTok, short episodic reels, 30-second reels, 15-second reels, streaming television on Amazon, Hulu, and Netflix, and anime, all of which I love. And I have a lot of students who want to tell stories through anime or other kinds of visual medium in my class. And I used to try to accommodate it because I dig that stuff, but I kind of had to draw the line not too long ago. I said, I can't, it doesn't work. This is a creative writing class. And part of that learning is to examine what works with all the elements and craft elements of the art form and what any kind of visual element, which again, I love. I mean, one of my favorite books of all time is Alison Bechdel's The Fun Home, which is a graphic novel of her coming up and coming out of the closet with family drama. And it's a great book. It's a graphic novel. But graphics often do the lifting of exposition, and exposition is a big important part of our toolbox. So how do and then sentence structure. I'm a big sucker for prosody and getting down to the sentence level and picking the right words. Well, let's pick a different word. What does that do? If you're using any number of words and any number of words in their synonyms, what's the power of the right word choice? And why are you deliberately choosing this word over that word? Why are you writing the passive voice versus the active voice? Why third person versus first person? You have all these choices that you need to make, and that's part of the fun, right? So we're sliding quickly, and I'll take a breath in a second because this is where AI comes in.
Yeah, I was going to.
So we have students who are highly informed by visual medium coming into the creative writing classroom on one hand, and then we have the infiltration of AI on the other. Again, I try to take a middle of the road kind of stance with AI. In general, um, I don't like it. I don't trust it. Um, I think it can be a good research tool, can be part of your arsenal. I think there are wise ways to use it. I know my colleagues who are teaching composition classes are struggling with the kinds of essays their students are submitting. But I maintain, and I've got a presentation about it that I do early in each semester, is that and why would you use AI in the creative writing classroom? Because if you are, you're just cheating yourself because it's not about writing something that's going to impress me. It's about learning. And ultimately, it's about the things I just talked about, the the art form, diction, prosody, the right word choice, the right sounding stuff, points of view, perspectives. And then it's ultimately about, what you're trying to figure out in your writing that concerns you, or you wouldn't be writing it. And it might be subconscious at the time. You don't even realize you're worried about this particular issue, but it's through the process of creating and revising and thinking that not only do you ultimately, I think, and I do believe this, arrive at the best sentence, but you start to figure out what you're trying to figure out, and you're always open to the greatest gift that any art form will provide you, and that's surprise, right?
Mm.
So there's no surprise in AI. There's no surprise in shortcuts. Um, so
Also, I think, well,
so
at
why
least certainly
rob
within
yourself of that experience?
right, certainly within the creative writing realm, I mean, much like with the just like general art practicing in terms of using AI to make, there are specific scenarios where you can use AI to make, images, but I think, it fundamentally misunderstands why one would practice an art form and like what human beings gain out of that sort of practice, right? That it is the actual, it is the process, it is the act in and of itself, and sort of struggling with that is where a lot of the value comes, not with the actual, final product in the end. um
Right.
and like, and if you wanted to use that, but I wonder, but you're dealing with both grad students and people sort of who are hyper self-selected, to people who are like, well, I love writing, right, to a certain, and
Exactly.
that's sort of the but in the broader sense around, for people who more casual, who don't necessarily have the same passion or relationship with writing, don't perceive sort of the same inherent value in that struggle, and use writing more in a utilitarian way.
Mhm.
I still worry that, as you were saying, like, these are powerful tools, but they're good tools if you know what to do. Otherwise, they quickly become crutches that leave you stunted in development.
Well, no, no
And never.
one, no one, no one writes a handwritten letter and mails it anymore. No one writes a cogent email and sends it off after an hour anymore. Now it's down to texting, and now it's down to these things. And part, I think, of what we're trying to get at here in this conversation is there is a value in processing something not instantaneously. I don't write longhand much anymore at all. Um, but it's communication, and there's something subtle and important, and at times can well be nefarious as we see politicians use language in various ways, or avoid using language in certain ways, or speak in the passive voice, which, sort of removes them from culpability of whatever the matter is that they're discussing. You know,
Why?
so we should be equally informed about the importance of language and communicating and using the right words and not just dashing off a thumbs up, you know.
I could talk about this forever, but I do have to say we send out a very cogent email once a week, talking about issues. But I want to pivot and do a topic shift for 1 minute, something that I appreciate your Catholic with a small c view of trends and things are coming. But to me, black and white is book banning. Is
Hmm.
that there might be some discussion, I don't feel, in school curriculum, but stay out of the libraries.
Yeah.
Do not come into the libraries and and take, I bought my house without the catty corner from the library. And no
Right.
one has ever put a gun to my head and said, you have to read this book. And Christy Nome wrote this book like object, put it in my library. I mean, uh, when I taught political philosophy at Towson University, we studied Mein Kampf. We studied the Book of Fascism by Mussolini. We need to read all types of interests and issues and diversity. But for people to come into a library and say, take this out, take this out, take this out, I think it's beyond reprehensible.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes against the very foundational uh, documents and ethos of the founding of this country. Um, another small story. I grew up in Hamden, for those of you who are not from listening in from Baltimore, is a historically white enclave in the northern part of the city. And it was the end of the railroad, and white mill workers would come from Appalachia, take the railroad down through Maryland, and the terminus was at the mills at the bottom of the hill in Hamden, making cotton duck sailcloth for Revolutionary War and on. The first One of the first black persons I encountered was the librarian at the local library in the neighborhood where I grew up, and who turned me on to stories by black writers about black people. And so, how do you go from that experience to just what the other day when President Trump criticized the Smithsonian for, like, why are you harping so much on how bad slavery was? Because it was evil,
Evil.
and it was 400 years of evilness. And it is very much the back upon which, the scarred back upon which the much of this country was built on. So you talk about book banning, Barry. That's, I think it's something that certain constituencies can get people riled up over, um, to help. And it's not about that book on that bookshelf at that library. It's ultimately about the freedom of speech, and that's going to then morph into something even more nefarious if we let it go unchecked. The reason why Dr. Carla Hayden was supposedly let go as Librarian of Congress is because of the types of library books that she was recommending be on the shelves and kids would have. It's not even what the Library of Congress is. It's not a lending institution. It's not a book lending institution. Now, granted, Dr. Carlin Hayden did amazing work in regard to DEI and diversity and welcoming and belonging during her time in Chicago and in Baltimore, but it's not the kind of institution the Library of Congress even is. So the very premise of her dismissal was invalid.
It's Library of Congress.
Right.
He has no constitutional or don't even get me. And we
I mean, but I think, the book bans get to what we were saying earlier in that, it is this recognition that stories and writing are extremely powerful as
Right.
ways to communicate ideas, and that people who need very specific narratives in order to keep power and control, right, are very threatened by open, free, societies and exchange of ideas, and so therefore need to ban books. Whereas, as Barry is pointing out, in much, our ideas can be steelman. We can go up against and read the other books and take a look at them and dissect them and fully synthesize information from there. But the authoritarian needs that sort of restriction of ideas in order to make sure that they have the control that they want.
And we've seen this blueprint time and time again.
Awesome. And as children, you may love your story about expanding as you grow up. As children, we have our immediate environment as our world. I didn't know Jews were a minority group until I left Lakewood, New Jersey. So I mean, it's a magic carpet ride. It is the best way to learn about diversity and other cultures and other people and expand our knowledge and our humanity and our understanding. And book banning is literally just the opposite. And I think to take it a step further, it's to negate the people's voices. We don't want to hear LGBTQ, or we don't want to hear about people dealing with racism or trying to assimilate. And so not only are they suppressing the books, they're suppressing the writers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, everything from the sexual awakening of adolescence. Oh my gosh! And well, it's stories, it's people, it's something that, at the very least, it unites us all and cuts across divides. Yeah, it's a really. We were talking about Flamer earlier, a book that was recently banned in a county not far from here. I know Fairfax County Public Library has dealt with book banning down in where Mason is located. And again, I think the very idea of book banning is, I think, interesting in the sense that you have to look who the source of the desire to have a book ban is. What why are you being threatened? What is the threat? Um, and, you know, I think there's been a lot of democratization happening both in the publishing business and in the kinds of stories that do get printed and bound and shared and disseminated through libraries. And that's amazing and that's wonderful. Um, it's part of why I'm also sort of just kind of shocked and dismayed by the whole DEI, the whole effort to cut the legs out from under DEI, because part of me, I've done all my work in a city that's been 65 to 70% African American. I've always partnered with, promoted, and grown as a human from the work of writers who did not look like me. So the fact that we needed things called DEI in the first place is a little dismaying to me, but also I can understand why. And the fact that I think, our president at George Mason, Gregory Washington, who's who is the first African American president at George Mason, was recently under fire by the Trump administration. But just before they turned their attention to Mason, they turned their attention to the University of Virginia on the other side of the state in Charlottesville. And the president there, James Ryan, who was promoted from Harvard and got the UVA gig because of his efforts in DEI, was dismissed a few short years later because of those same efforts and same beliefs and same strategies. So it's not the people who have changed, it's the world around them. And I think part of what I try to do, and part of what I know you both try to do, is keep the banner high, um, uh, uh, in regard to the efforts that people are still making and will continue to make, um, in on behalf of social justice, economic justice, educational justice, and the accessibility to. I mean, we're having this conversation on a fancy computer on Zoom, and the internet. The internet is not as widely accessible to our citizens as it should be. So there are a lot of things that still need a lot of attention. And we're going to get through the next 3 years. The hole that's going to be dug is going to be deep and painful. Um, uh, and I worry about some things that might be set in place that are going to be a little bit more difficult to scale back but but I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I really believe, I really do. It's going back to sketching superhero comics as a kid. I believe good's going to prevail. Um, and you two are an example of that.
I appreciate that. I think, it occurred to me as you were speaking and talking about sort of uniting around stories, that despite often being a solitary activity, that storytelling, that reading is actually something that, like, if you read alone, right, you don't feel alone. Right, you're drawn into another story. It often increases connection and sort of the feeling of collective humanity, at least in my own experience. And ironically, it's sort of the exact opposite that you often get from engaging with the so-called social media
Right.
on here, which, despite putatively being something where everyone is constantly sharing and thus should be somewhat socially, without sort of narrative, without story, it actually ends up being a much more isolating experience. And so I think that um having that creative storytelling and that writing, um is this just it is we're going to need that sort of activity to practice in order to bring people together enough to get through this time, and that having those sorts of uniting narratives and uniting experiences are what's going to end up creating the community and the solidarity fundamentally to fight back against these the authoritarianism, the anti-intellectualism, the anti against the arts, and the anti-humanity sort of strain that we're currently facing right now. But
And, and now you're dancing around with a conversation about the power of metaphor. And what metaphor does is, again, goes back to those specific concrete stories of one particular time or people, and is able to then transcend those particulars to have universal importance. And that's, I think, also dovetails into book banning because uh, authoritarian powers are afraid of metaphor and afraid of story because it's the storytellers that can transcend um, the differences that we all naturally have as human beings. Um,
yeah.
you know,
And well, I want to thank you, so much, both for sharing your own parts of your own story, and re-highlighting the importance of story in these times. Uh, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Greg.
oh, it's
And
been a pleasure.
yeah, it's been such a fascinating conversation. We really hope to have you back on again sometime soon.
Don't shop on Tuesday, but keep telling stories.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Greg, and thank everyone for listening. Until next time, don't shop on Tuesday.